This high inflation is not going to go away. It's not going to go away anytime soon. In fact, it's not going to go away anytime in this decade. We have a lot of inflation in the pipeline, and we have yet to really begun to deal with it. Most people think that we're only suffering from the monetary policy mistakes made after COVID. And if the Fed had simply started hiking rates sooner and stopped doing QE sooner, we wouldn't be experiencing all this inflation. No, we would be experiencing all this inflation because the mistakes started decades before. We are paying the price for monetary policy mistakes going back into the early 1990s or even late 1980s. It's not simply the mistakes that were made after 2020. It was all the mistakes that were made prior to 2020. But another reason that inflation is not going to go away is because we still have negative real interest rates. Despite the tightening, we still have stimulative monetary policy. Even when the Fed hikes rates to 4% in November, you're still half the inflation rate. You're still discouraging people from saving and encouraging people to take on more debt. You are stoking inflation's fires. You're not putting it out. But even worse than the headline number was the core. Now, remember, the core is more important to the Fed than the headline because it strips out food and energy. Even though food and energy are probably the most important parts of the CPI, the Fed likes to ignore those and focus on everything else. But if you focus on everything else, that 0.6% rise is a big number. But in other words, we're going in the wrong direction. Core CPI is going up, not down. The Fed is getting further away from its goal of returning core CPI to 2%. In fact, we're still more than triple 2%. And again, what investors don't understand is we're not going to go from 8.2% or 8.5% inflation, whatever the peak was so far, all the way back down to 2% so easy. It's going to take a long time for inflation to return to 2%. Again, I doubt it's going to return to 2% anytime during this decade. One piece of news that did come out this week was Pepsi, which reported its earnings, but also revealed that it has increased its prices by 17% year over year. Now, that number dwarfs the official rise in the CPI. It's basically doubled, a little bit more than double the official increase in the CPI. Now, I think what's happening at Pepsi is more indicative of what's actually happening to the cost of living than the CPI, because Pepsi's prices are real prices. There's no hedonics, there's no substitution. They are what they are. And they've raised prices by 17%. That probably reflects what's going on with inflation. Because remember, Pepsi doesn't want to raise prices. It's trying not to. And in fact, remember early days in the inflation, all of these companies were eating these price hikes. They thought it was transitory, and so they were absorbing the higher costs. They weren't raising prices. If you recall, back then, I said that eventually all these companies are going to throw in the towel on transitory inflation, and they're going to start raising their prices because they're going to realize that the transitory inflation is permanent, and they need higher prices to recover their higher costs. And that is exactly what's going on. So a 17% inflation rate, to me, is more believable than the government's 8.5%. And what Pepsi is selling is what Americans are buying. This is what's going on with prices. But getting back to these numbers, the inflation rate in 1984, though, was back up to 4.3%. 1985, 3.5%. We had 1 year of below 2% inflation during the entire decade of the 1980s, and that was 1986 when it was 1.9. But the very next year, it shot back up to 3.66. Then 1988, it was 4.08. 1989, it was 4.83. And in 1980, it was 5.4. These are some pretty big numbers, nowhere near 2%. And then if you look at the inflation rates during the 1990s, when we really started to have the change in CPI incorporated, we only had 1 year during the 1990s where inflation was below 2%. That was 1998, when it was 1.55%. So these were much higher rates than the 2% that the Fed is hoping to get down to. But the problem is we have printed so much money since then. The debts are so much larger that bringing an inflation rate down to the level we had in the 1980s and 1990s or 2000s is nearly impossible. The only time we really had inflation of around 2% was after the 2008 financial crisis. In 2010, we had a 1.64% year. 2013, we had 1.46. 2014, 1.62. 2015 was the absolute bottom. We only had an inflation rate of 0.12%. So as far as the Fed was concerned, that was a very dangerous year because we treaded very close to deflation. We didn't quite get it, but prices barely rose. Then we had a 1.26% rise in 2016. Then we started to have inflation moving back up. 2017, 2018, it was back up to 2.44%. And then we started to head back down in 2019, down to 1.81%. And then 2020 was the last year of sub 2% inflation at 1.23. And then it really started to shoot up in 2021 at 4.7. But my point is, we're not going down to 2%. The aberration was the inflation of 2% or less that we got following the 2008 financial crisis, but before the COVID crisis. But now what we're going to have is a lot of high inflation to make up for all those years of low inflation. It's a reversion to the mean, except we're really not going to revert to the mean. We're going to revert to something much higher than the mean because of massive and unprecedented money printing that has gone on, not just since COVID, but before COVID. Look at what's happened to the Fed's balance sheet. It's gone from under $1 trillion before the 2008 financial crisis to almost $9 trillion post-COVID. And look how many years the Fed was flooding the economy with near free money. And the financial bubbles that have been inflated dwarf anything that had been inflated prior to this time period. So this has been unprecedented monetary inflation, and it's going to be an unprecedented increase in consumer prices that Americans are going to deal with. So this idea that inflation is going to come down is completely wrong. The question is, when are the markets going to come to terms with this reality? Because so far, they're living in fantasy land. Because once again, when we got this hotter than expected inflation number, the immediate reaction was a rise in the dollar and a sell-off in gold. And the same action was repeated on Friday. More dollar strength, more gold weakness. Why? Higher inflation is bad for the dollar by definition. It means the dollar is losing value. It's losing more value than you thought. So if something is losing value faster than you thought, why would you want to buy it even more? The same thing with gold. Inflation is going up, not down. Gold is an inflation hedge. You buy gold when there's inflation. Well, we got more inflation than the markets expected, yet everybody dumped gold. Again, it's the same reason. Every time we get hotter than expected inflation, instead of the markets coming to terms with the reality that the Fed is losing its inflation fight, the markets just believe that the Fed is now going to have to fight even harder to win. But nobody doubts that the Fed will win. And nobody doubts that the Fed will fight as hard as they have to win. And so since they believe that the Fed has to fight harder, they want to buy the dollar and sell gold because fighting harder means even higher interest rates. not only are things going to be much more expensive because we no longer have the products, but you're not going to be able to put them on a credit card. You're going to have to buy the products and pay for them with cash. Forget about this buy now, pay later crap. That's over. You got to buy now and pay now, and you got to pay 3, 4, 5 times what you used to pay. If you look at where interest rates are and what the interest on the national debt is likely to be at the end of next year, we really need to cut government spending by about 50% in order to balance the budget. That shows you how out of whack it is and how far we're living beyond our means. Nobody is willing to cut the budget at all, let alone by 50%. So, there is no political way out of this. It's just not going to happen. So the reality is inflation is what's going to happen, right? The money is going to lose a lot of value. The key is going to be to prevent hyperinflation. That's going to be the key, to prevent the dollar from losing all of its value. So people are going to lose the value of government benefits. So let's say you're getting Social Security. The real value of those benefits at a minimum is going to be cut in half. That's reality. But the worst case would be if the value of your Social Security benefits go down by 90% or 99%, right? Mm-hmm. So they're basically worthless because the currency is completely destroyed. So that's the outcome that we have to prevent. But I don't think there's any political chance that we're going to do the right thing. I mean, what I would do personally is I would give a big haircut to everybody, including the bondholders. I would not pay the treasuries off 100% on the dollar. We'd have to restructure because everybody has to participate in the pain, including people who bought U.S. treasuries. And if that means U.S. treasuries are downgraded, well, that's what it means. It doesn't matter because the government can't pay. Because if we're going to cut Social Security, if we're going to cut Medicare, if we're going to cut government pensions, if we're going to ask middle-class Americans to take a big haircut, we have to ask wealthy investors, especially who own U.S. treasuries, to take a haircut too. They took a risk. They loaned money to the U.S. government. The U.S. government was clearly bankrupt. They deserve what they get. First of all, the biggest threat is that the pensions aren't even pensions. It's a Ponzi. It's not a pension. If it was a pension, it would be funded. Now, some pensions are underfunded, and there's problems with those. But Social Security isn't funded at all. It's not like it's underfunded. It doesn't have any funding. Its funding is future taxpayers, right? So It's not like there's any income that's being generated on investments that were made with money. On a normal pension, if I pay into a pension, when I retire, I'm getting my own money back, plus the income that's been earned through investments of my money that I've been putting in over the years. Well, when somebody gets money from Social Security, they're not getting back their own money. Their own money was spent, a long time ago. They're getting back the new money that somebody else puts in. And the only chance that new guy has of getting his money is if the government finds somebody in the future to put that money in, right? So it's a whole Ponzi scheme. But it can't work. You can look at the nature of the Ponzi. When it first started out, there were like 50 people paying taxes for every one person that was collecting a benefit. So, okay, it worked. Now it's more like 2 to 1. Pretty soon it'll be 1 to 1, right? It can't work. You can't, one person can't support himself and an entirely an additional person. The numbers just don't make it. And so it's all going to be paid for by printing money, which just destroys the value of everybody's money, not just the Social Security money. When the government wipes out Social Security benefits through inflation, it wipes out everything. All dollars lose value. It doesn't matter where they are, even if they're stuffed under your mattress, right? They're all going to lose. But I still don't think the mainstream really understands the significance of what this means and how life in America will change so profoundly if the dollars, or when the dollar's reserve currency status is lost. Well, first, for consumers, the reason that our consumption-based economy works is because of the dollar status. We're able to export dollars and import real goods. We have $1 trillion a year trade deficit, and we pay for all that merchandise just by printing money. So we don't have to expend any resources, yet we can import $1 trillion worth of goods that the rest of the world consumed considerable resources producing. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're not going to be able to run these trade deficits anymore. Our trade is going to have to be brought into balance. And that means basically, let's say $1 trillion worth of merchandise every year disappears from our shelves. And there's really nothing to replace it with. So what's left is just going to be that much more expensive because not that, many people will be able to buy what's there, right? So your prices have to go way up because the supply of goods has gone way down. Also, credit is going to become far less plentiful because the reverse of this, right? We've been able to send out these dollars that we just create out of thin air and get $1 trillion a year worth of goods that are produced in factories by real workers, right? And then we give them these dollars. And then what do the Chinese or everybody else do with those dollars? They lend them back to us, right? They buy mortgage-backed securities. They buy securitized credit card debt or all these debt instruments that are created. They buy them. So they supply us with goods and then they loan us the money right back after they get paid. And so what's going to happen is we're not going to get the goods anymore, but we're also not going to get the credit. And so consumer credit rates are going to skyrocket. So not only are things going to be much more expensive because we no longer have the products, but you're not going to be able to put them on a credit card. You're going to have to buy the products and pay for them with cash. Forget about this buy now, pay later crap. That's over. You got to buy now and pay now. And you got to pay 3, 4, 5 times what you used to pay. Yeah. And of course, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. There's going to be massive unemployment initially when the dollar loses its reserve currency status, because that reserve status has supported this consumer economy that is really just a gigantic distribution center where we import goods from the rest of the world and then we distribute it throughout the country. And you have all these stores that people go to buy all this imported stuff that has been, distributed. So it's all logistics and shipping and retail. But when you take away the underlying products that all this service sector economy is based on, then everything that was built on top crashes down. So if you don't have any more merchandise on the shelves at Walmart, you don't need all these Walmarts anymore. There's too many of them. We got nothing to put on the shelves. We don't need all the people that work there. We don't need all the people that were delivering the goods. We don't need all this stuff collapses when you pull out the bottom, which is the stuff. And so unemployment is going to be widespread. We're going to have to rebuild a legitimate economy that is self-sufficient, meaning that if we want to consume, we got to produce. If we want to borrow, somebody else in America has to save. We can't rely on the world's manufacturing capacity, and we can't rely on the world's savings. We have to rely on ourselves, like we did in the 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s, or go further back when we were an exporting nation, when we were a creditor nation. We have to get back to where we were, but we can't get back there with today's level of government. We need a dramatic reduction in the size and scope of our government. We need lower taxes. We need fewer regulations. But in order to make that possible, we need massive cuts in government spending. Now, again, if we don't get that, we just get inflation that wipes everything out, and then we're going to have to start all over again. But it's going to be very difficult to start over again, especially given the way the political winds have been blowing, given how dumbed down the electorate is. It's very scary to be in this situation because America may end up going all in on socialism. I mean, we've been, going down that road to serfdom for a long time, and we may finally get there, and just blame all this on freedom and capitalism and just say the solution is the government has complete control over the U.S. economy. And, then we're Cuba, or Soviet Union or something like that. I mean, so it's very scary where this may eventually head.